she wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that room, not in that dress, not standing in front of 500 creatures who had lived long enough to forget what surprise felt like. And yet, there she was. A waitress from Queens, rough hands, eyes red from a grief she'd been carrying since she was 9 years old, pressed against her chest like a prayer. A single silver bracelet that had once belonged to her father. The room went absolutely silent. Then she opened her mouth. What happened in that silence would change everything, but to understand why, we have to go back to the beginning. It was a Thursday night in November when the storm came to Manhattan. Rain hammered the black glass windows of Vetroscuro, a name most people in the city had never heard. The few who had were wise enough never to say it twice. From the outside, it looked like any other private club on the Upper East Side, velvet rope, men in suits, the quiet hum of money-changing hands. But inside, beneath the low amber light and the ghost of old cigar smoke, the air carried something else, something older, something that made the back of your neck prickle if you stood still long enough. Vetroscuro was neutral ground, a place where vampire clans settled debts, brokered power, and reminded each other, politely, always politely, of exactly who they were. And at table 4, beneath a chandelier that had hung there since 1887, sat the man who needed no reminder at all. Klaus, the Vampire King, 500 years old, appearing no more than 35, long white hair, a jawline like something carved from old stone, eyes the color of winter ice, beautiful and completely empty. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He sat the way only the very powerful sit, completely still, with the quiet certainty that the world would arrange itself around him. He had lived through plagues, through wars, through the slow collapse of empires. He had watched everyone he ever loved turn to ash. Tonight was supposed to be a private celebration, a rare performance of Queen of the Night, arranged just for him. A small luxury from a man who allowed himself very few. But the opera singer was stranded at JFK. The storm had seen to that. Klaus simply reached for his wine. Reese didn't know any of this. She knew only the weight of the tray in her hands, the ache behind her knees from a double shift that had started before sunrise, and the quiet ritual she performed every night before walking into a room full of strangers. 3 slow breaths, eyes down, disappear. She was 24 years old and already an expert at being invisible. Her hands were rough from dishwater and cold tile. Tucked beneath her left sleeve, always, a silver bracelet. Her father's, the only thing of his she had left. She touched it like a compass when she was afraid. She had learned to sing from him, Luciano Russo, an opera singer with a voice like cathedral bells, and a laugh that filled whatever room he walked into. He had died when she was 9. The official cause was poisoning. Reese had never believed it. She believed in finishing her shift. She believed in sending money home. She believed that one day her voice would find the room it deserved. Tonight was not that night, or so she thought. She approached table 4 without looking up, poured the wine the way she always did. Steady hand, slight lean, eyes on the glass. Then Rocco, The enormous man seated across from Klaus slammed his fist on the table. The bottle slipped. Deep red wine cascaded across the white linen, directly onto the Vampire King's $5,000 suit. The room went silent, the way rooms only go silent when something has gone very, very wrong. Rhys looked up. Klaus looked at her. The ice in his eyes didn't melt, it sharpened. Then, slowly, almost gently, he smiled, just enough to show the edge of something white and pointed behind his lips. "Human blood," he said quietly, "is easier to wash off than red wine." No one laughed, no one moved. The Vampire King studied her the way a man studies something unexpected, not with anger, with the particular attention of someone reassessing a situation entirely. Then he leaned back and did something no one in that room anticipated. He smirked. "If you can sing this opera aria," he said, almost to himself, the words carrying just far enough for the whole table to hear, "I'll marry you. Before we go any further, think about this. If a stranger offered you protection, but it came with a price you didn't choose, would you take it?" Drop a 1 in the comments if you would. Drop a 2 if you'd walk away. There's no wrong answer. But Rhys's answer might surprise you. Rhys's hand was still on the bottle, her father's bracelet pressed cold against her wrist. She had spent her entire life learning how to disappear. She had no idea everything was about to change. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Stay with us. No one had ever looked at Rhys the way Klaus looked at her in that moment. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, not with the practiced indifference of a man pretending not to notice the help. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't belong where it is, and yet somehow fits perfectly. The silence had weight. Every creature at every table had turned toward table 4 the way wolves turn toward a sound in the dark, not out of concern, out of calculation. A waitress who had just ruined the Vampire King's evening was either very unlucky, or she was about to become useful. Klaus tilted his head. "There was supposed to be music tonight," he said, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it. The singer missed her flight, the storm. His gaze drifted to the rain-lashed windows, then back to her. "Tell me, do you sing?" Rhys's mouth went dry. She told herself to say no, to apologize, set down the bottle, and walk back to the kitchen the way she had walked into 100 rooms before, quietly, without leaving a trace. But her father's bracelet pressed against her wrist like a hand holding hers, and something in her chest, something she had locked away for 15 years, moved. "Yes," she said. The word surprised her as much as it surprised anyone else in the room. Klaus smiled again. This time it reached his eyes. That was somehow more frightening than the fangs. He phrased it as a wager. "Sing the Queen of the Night aria, all of it, perfectly, and I will consider the evening's inconvenience settled." A beat. "Fail," he continued, "and you disappear, quietly, the way people do when they wander into the wrong room." Rocco shifted in his seat. The sound was like a boulder settling. Somewhere behind her, Rhys heard a sharp intake of breath. She didn't need to turn around. She knew it was Lena, her best friend, also working the floor that night, watching from the shadows near the bar. "Run," Lena would be thinking. "He's dangerous. Run." But Reese was not running. She was remembering. She is 9 years old. Sunday morning. The apartment smells like coffee and sheet music. Her father, Luciano, with his big hands and his bigger laugh, is standing in the kitchen conducting an imaginary orchestra with a wooden spoon. "Reese," he says, "you know why the Queen of the Night sings so fiercely?" She shakes her head. "Because she has already lost everything," he says. His voice gentles. "She is not asking anyone to save her. She is telling the world, I am still here. I am still standing. Hear me." He taps her chest, just above her heart. "The voice lives here, not in the throat, here. When you are afraid, when you are tired, when the world makes you feel small, you breathe, you find it, and you let it speak." She never told him how often she came back to that morning. She never got the chance. Back in the present, Reese set the wine bottle on the edge of the table. She straightened her spine, chin level, shoulders back. She touched her father's bracelet once. Then she sang. The first note cut through the room like light through a crack in a door. Small, then suddenly everywhere. By the second phrase, 3 wine glasses had developed hairline fractures. By the bridge, the chandeliers were trembling. And by the climax, the impossible high F, 2 vampires near the back dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by a frequency that reached back into something ancient and instinctual. Reese did not notice any of this. She was somewhere else entirely, standing in a Sunday kitchen, her father conducting with a wooden spoon, the smell of coffee, the feeling of being known. When the final note faded, the room was so quiet she could hear the rain. Then Klaus stood up. He placed his hands together slowly, deliberately, and began to applaud. The rest of the room followed, even those still wincing. For the first time in 300 years, the Vampire King was genuinely surprised. "Extraordinary," he said simply. Then, "I believe I said, if you can sing this opera aria, I'll marry you." He had smirked when he said it the first time, certain it was a game he had already won. He was not smirking now. She did not say yes. She asked for a name. The name of the person who had killed her father. The shift in the room was immediate. Rocco's expression darkened. Several council members exchanged glances. No one had ever turned down the Vampire King. Certainly no one had immediately leveraged his word into a demand. Klaus studied her for a long moment. "Victor Sterling," he said. 700 years old, silver hair, eyes like a snake that has learned to wear a suit. He paused. "He is also trying to kill me." In the armored car, rain hammering the roof, Klaus explained the rest. Victor Sterling was the architect of an underground trafficking network, the largest in the supernatural world. Human victims, enslaved and drained. Sterling had run it for decades beneath the cover of legitimate commerce. Luciano had discovered evidence, tried to warn the council, been caught in the attempt, drained and left to die. The death disguised as poisoning. Reese sat very still and listened. She had spent 15 years believing her father died because the world was careless with good people. She had not known he died because he was brave. Something inside her shifted. The grief did not leave. It never fully leaves, but it rearranged itself. It moved from her chest to her spine. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because Sterling was in that room tonight," Klaus said. "He recognized your voice. He recognized something in your blood that even you don't understand yet. And he will come for you." A pause. "Marriage under the ancient blood law makes you untouchable. It is the only protection that holds." Klaus Tower was another world entirely. Centuries of collected beauty, arranged with the precision of a man who had too much time and too little warmth to fill it. Ancient manuscripts beside modern sculpture. A piano no one had played in decades. Rocco showed her to the living quarters, set a glass of water on the nightstand, then added a small plate of food without being asked. "He's not what he looks like," Rocco said gruffly at the door. "Neither am I," Reese replied. Rocco's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she would see from him for a long time. Alone, she sat on the edge of the bed and held her father's bracelet in both hands. Lena had texted 7 times. The last message read only, "Reese, what is happening?" She almost laughed. "Tell the world, I am still here. I am still standing. Hear me." 3 days later, they stood together in the grand ballroom of the Vampire Masquerade Gala. Reese wore deep crimson. A diamond necklace, ancient, carrying traces of something she didn't yet have a name for, rested at her collarbone. She had looked in the mirror before leaving and barely recognized herself. Not a ghost, she thought, not invisible. Klaus kept one hand at the small of her back, steady and sure, the way you hold something you're afraid of losing in a crowd. Around them, ghostly violin music echoed through the ballroom. He spoke quietly about each figure in the room, their histories, their rivalries, the way a guide walks you through a museum, pointing out what is beautiful and what is dangerous, and how often those are the same thing. She found herself laughing once, a small, startled sound she immediately tried to pull back. Klaus looked at her when she laughed. Something in his eyes flickered. During the dance, he told her the full truth about her father. The evidence Luciano tried to carry, the risk he understood, the courage he chose anyway. He told her quietly, the way you tell someone something sacred. Reese did not cry. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright. "Use it," Klaus murmured, close to her ear. "Let the anger become armor." She looked up at him. For one unguarded moment, neither of them looked like what they were. They were still on the stairs when Rocco appeared from the shadows, jaw set, eyes hard. 3 words before the night fractured. "Check the car." The brake lines had been cut. A device discovered beneath the chassis seconds before the driver turned the key. Someone who knew their schedule, their route, their car. Motorcycles emerged from the dark. Klaus pushed Reese hard behind a stone pillar as Rocco pulled an armored vehicle, screaming to the curb. A shot caught Klaus in the shoulder. He did not make a sound. They drove hard. Reese pressed her hands against his wound, felt him go still beneath her touch. "Why didn't you run?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Because I want to win," she said. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face broke open, just slightly, like light through a crack in very old stone. Later, in the safe house, Klaus fell into an uneasy sleep. And in that sleep, something moved across his face that Reese had no context for. A name, half formed on his lips. Vladimir. She did not know that name yet. She would. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay in the room, even when every instinct says otherwise. If this story is speaking to something in your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. That was the point. From the outside, it gleamed white against the black November water. A private charter vessel docked at a Hudson River pier, lit up, hosting what the invitation called an evening of rare music and rare pleasures, uniformed staff, crystal flutes, the kind of event that certain members of the Vampire Council attended without asking too many questions, because the questions themselves were a kind of debt. Victor Sterling had always understood that the best hiding place for something terrible was somewhere beautiful. Reese adjusted the hidden earpiece beneath her upswept hair, took one breath at the bottom of the gangway. 3 breaths, her father used to say, then you walk in like you belong. She took only 1. She walked in like she owned the place. She wore a silver dress Klaus had chosen. Silver disrupts their ability to track by scent, he had explained. In the clinical, practical way she had come to recognize as his version of caring. The earpiece crackled softly as she moved through the crowd. Klaus's voice, low and steady. Sterling is at the east end of the ballroom. Don't look directly at him. Walk to the performers' corridor. You're an accompanist for Venezia. Venezia is stranded at JFK, Reese murmured behind a smile. Sterling doesn't know that yet. She moved through the room the way she had always moved through difficult rooms. Chin level, eyes careful, making herself just visible enough to be unremarkable. Around her, Vampire Council members in black tie laughed with the easy confidence of people who had never once feared consequences. Below deck, she knew, the Vampire King was moving through the ship's service corridors, silent, methodical, working toward the server room, toward the records that would finally name every name and account for every victim. Just get to the stage, she told herself. Be the distraction, let him work. She had not let herself think, not fully, about what it meant that her father had once stood somewhere very much like this, gathering exactly this kind of evidence, and had not made it home. She touched her bracelet beneath the silver dress and kept walking. The grand piano sat at the center of the ballroom stage, gleaming untouched. Reese settled onto the bench with the practiced calm of someone who had performed in far less forgiving rooms. Diners at 6 in the morning, subway platforms at midnight, a queen's kitchen where she had once sung an entire aria just to keep herself from crying. She began with O mio babbino caro. The choice was not accidental. It was a daughter's plea, a song about love stubborn enough to override fear. She had sung it at her father's grave when she was 12, alone, because she had not known what else to bring him. The room quieted the way rooms do when something genuinely beautiful enters them. Not the polite silence of obligation, the involuntary hush of creatures, however ancient, however cold, remembering for a moment what it felt like to be moved. Sterling stood at the edge of the crowd, swirling his drink, watching her with his snake-red eyes. She watched him back, peripherally, and kept singing. The earpiece went to static. One moment, Klaus's voice was there. I've got the server room, 30 seconds. And then it was gone, not faded, deliberately cut. Reese's fingers continued moving over the keys. Her voice continued rising, but something cold moved through her chest that had nothing to do with the song. He said 30 seconds. It has been 3 minutes. Across the ballroom, Sterling turned from the crowd and walked toward the stage. He was not hurrying. He didn't need to. The smile on his face was the particular smile of a man who has already won, who is simply waiting for the other side to understand it. He made a small gesture, almost lazy, drew one finger across his throat. 2 figures materialized from the sides of the stage. Reese had exactly enough time to think. The earpiece isn't static, it's been jammed. Before hands closed around her arms and lifted her from the bench, the audience continued applauding. No one looked twice. This, she would later understand, was the most frightening thing of all. How easily the world continues its performance while something terrible happens just off stage. They took her below. The cargo hold was cold in the way rooms are cold when warmth has never once been welcome in them. Steel walls. Engine noise like a grinding heartbeat. The smell of salt and iron and something older that coated the back of her throat. She saw the containers first. Rows of them, climate-controlled, locked. And from behind the locked doors, silence. The specific, exhausted silence of people who have been silent so long they have forgotten how to ask for anything. Oh, she thought, just that. Oh. Sterling stood in the center of the hold with the patience of a man who finds drama tedious. Arthur, thin, bespectacled, 200 years old, and apparently willing to trade everything for 50 more years of life, stood at his shoulder, holding a tablet. Eyes averted from Reese, the way people avert their eyes when they cannot bear to witness the consequences of their own choices, and against the far wall, chained in restraints that bit wherever they touched, was Klaus. His face was bruised, black at his temple, his white hair hung forward, and his eyes, those winter ice eyes she had watched shift, slowly, from empty to something warmer, were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something close to dread, not for himself, for her. "Miss Russo," Sterling said pleasantly, "what a voice! Your father had one almost as fine." He tilted his head. "Almost." Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides. Do not let him see it. Do not let him have it. Sterling opened one of the cargo containers. Inside, people, pale, hollow-eyed, leaning against one another, alive but barely. The human cost of his operation made undeniable. Reese looked at them and felt something happen inside her that she did not have a word for yet. Not fear, not quite anger. The moment when a person understands, bone deep, what they are willing to do. "Give me a microphone," she said. Sterling found this amusing. Arthur produced a wireless microphone with the weariness of a man who had long since stopped asking questions. Reese turned to face the sound system, a professional rig mounted at intervals along the hold's ceiling. She could see the amplifier panel to her left, the volume dial currently at 40%. She reached out and turned it to maximum. Then she positioned herself close to the nearest speaker, faced Sterling, and sang. Not a requiem, not a farewell. She opened her throat and released the high F from Queen of the Night. the same note that had fractured wine glasses at Vetroscuro weeks ago. The same note her father had told her lived not in the throat, but in the chest. She held it, pushed it, let it become something that was no longer simply music. The feedback detonated through the sound system. Vampires dropped, some clutching their ears as they stumbled. Sterling's composure cracked. For one unguarded second, something genuinely afraid moved through those snake-red eyes. Arthur hit the floor first. Klaus felt the electronic restraint locks fail in the chaos. He drove his shoulder into the chair. Once, twice, the damaged chains gave. Reese drove the microphone stand into the nearest attacker with both hands. Klaus crossed the hold and hit Sterling with the focused force of a man who had been patient long enough. A weapon recovered from a fallen guard. One shot. Sterling went down. Klaus pulled Reese against him. She was bleeding from a cut above her ear. He was bleeding from everywhere. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You turned the volume up," he said. "You told me to use my anger as armor," she said into his shoulder. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Rocco secured Arthur and looked at them both with the expression of a man who has witnessed many things and still finds this particular evening remarkable. "Sterling wasn't the last enemy," a voice said from the doorway. A female council member stood there, eyes moving between the scene in front of her and the open containers behind them. There are others, and they already know what she is. Before Sterling's eyes closed entirely, his lips moved. "You still don't know the truth about her blood, or about his brother." And in that moment, she realized the terrible truth. This was never only about her father. It had always been about who she was. And someone else had known it long before she did. There are moments when the truth we've been running from finally catches up and changes everything. If this story is moving you, stay with us. The most powerful part is still ahead. The USB drive was the size of a thumb. It contained the names of 412 victims, shipment records spanning 3 continents, financial ledgers connecting Victor Sterling's network to 11 Vampire Council members, 2 officials in the human world, and a real estate holding company that had operated undetected, unremarkable, out of a glass tower in Midtown for 37 years. Klaus held it in his palm in the back of the armored vehicle and said nothing. Rocco drove. Reese sat beside Klaus, a bandage above her ear, her silver dress torn at the shoulder, her father's bracelet still on her wrist. The city moved past the windows in long amber streaks. "It's over," Reese said quietly. "Sterling's portion," Klaus replied. His voice was steady, but she had learned, over weeks, how to read what lived beneath the steadiness. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was staring at the drive. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. That, she had also learned, was itself an answer. They were 40 minutes from the city when 3 black vehicles materialized from side streets at once, moving with the coordination of something planned long in advance. Rocco swerved hard, tires screaming. The vehicles boxed them in with surgical precision and forced them to a stop on a rain-slicked overpass, the East River 30 feet below. Doors opened. Figures stepped into the headlights. Then the last door opened. and Rhys understood why Klaus had gone so perfectly, terribly still. The man who stepped out resembled Klaus the way a storm resembles weather. Technically the same category, but an entirely different order of magnitude. Older in the way immortals are sometimes older, not in the face, which appeared around 40, but in the eyes, blazing red. Patient with the patience of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 4 centuries. "Brother," Vladimir said. Klaus stepped out of the vehicle. The rain came down between them like a curtain being drawn. "You were dead," Klaus said, his voice so controlled it was almost nothing. Almost. "I was waiting," Vladimir replied. "You always did take too long with things, Klaus. Decisions, attachments." His red eyes moved to Rhys. "Feelings." Klaus, 500 years old, standing in the rain. He remembered his brother at 20, before the centuries stacked between them like unpaid debts. Vladimir teaching him to fight in a frozen courtyard. Vladimir laughing at his terrible aim. Vladimir, who had once been the only person in the world who called him by name without wanting something. He had mourned him for 400 years, added that loss to all the others, shaped himself around the grief the way a tree shapes itself around a wound. And all that time, the wound had been watching, Rhys watching from the vehicle. She thought about what it meant to be betrayed by someone who was supposed to be on your side, by someone who knew you well enough to know exactly where to cut. She had lived with that particular grief since she was 9. She knew its weight. She watched Klaus standing in the rain and thought, "He has been carrying this longer than I have been alive. And there is no one on this overpass who is going to do anything about that. Except maybe her." She opened the door. Vladimir's forces moved first. 12 attackers, trained in the old ways, fast, brutal, without hesitation. They hit Rocco like a wave hitting a wall. And to his credit, Rocco held. Klaus and Vladimir collided with the force of 5 centuries of unfinished conversation. She watched Klaus hold back. That fraction of a second before each strike where memory intervened. Vladimir used it every time, slipping inside his guard the way only someone who had sparred with you for decades could. He was winning, and Klaus was allowing it. And Rhys understood why, because somewhere beneath the blazing red eyes and 400 years of calculated betrayal, Klaus was still looking for his brother. Vladimir knocked Klaus from the railing. He hit hard. He did not get up immediately. Rhys was already moving. She reached him before anyone else, dropped to her knees on the rain-slicked steel. Her hands found his face. "Stay with me," she said. She pressed her hybrid blood against the cut at his temple. Quickly, without hesitation, the way you do something you have already decided. The effect moved through him like a current, a shudder, then stillness, then something like the intake of breath before a person chooses to keep going. Klaus looked up at her. His eyes, the winter ice eyes she had first seen, across a wine-stained table in a room full of dangerous things, held nothing empty in them anymore. "I told you," she said quietly, "I want to win." She stood. She turned to face the overpass, the rain, the fighting, the ancient tangle of loyalty and jealousy and grief playing out in the dark. And she breathed. Once, not 3 times, once, because she had learned, finally, that she did not need the full ritual anymore. Then she sang. Not the queen of the night, not a weapon. She sang the aria her father had hummed on Sunday mornings in a queen's kitchen. Gentle, aching, stubborn as an old love. A song about the people we carry with us, the losses that teach us what we are willing to fight for. Her voice rose above the rain. The storm answered, not with violence, but with the particular quiet that sometimes falls inside the worst of things when something true breaks through. Vladimir faltered. Not from pain, because the frequency touched something the centuries had not managed to fully extinguish. A courtyard in winter, a younger brother with terrible aim. Klaus Rosa. He crossed the deck to Vladimir with grief plain on his face, unguarded, unhidden. The most honest thing Reese had ever seen him do. He embraced his brother, one arm around him, a blade in the other hand, a mercy and a sorrow at once. I would have given you anything, Klaus said. His voice broke, the crack of something held together by will alone for far too long. All you had to do was ask. Vladimir said nothing. He closed his eyes. Klaus held him until it was over. The way you hold someone you have missed and mourned, and cannot save and cannot stop loving, all at the same time. The rain continued. Reese did not look away. In the aftermath, as the council's investigators arrived in unmarked vehicles, Klaus sat on the railing with his head bowed. Reese sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She did not speak. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone is simply your presence in the dark. After a long while, Klaus spoke. Vladimir was there the night your father died. She went still. He told Sterling where Luciano was going, what he was carrying. Klaus's jaw tightened. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know, but I should have. Klaus. He stopped. She turned to look at him. This ancient, impossible, deeply wounded man who had held an empire together with nothing but will, who had just spent 400 years grieving the person who destroyed it from the inside. My father made a choice, she said. He knew the risk. He went anyway. She touched her bracelet, the old compass habit, one final time. That's not on you. That's who he was. Klaus looked at her the way he had looked at her that very first night. Recognition. You carry his courage, he said, every note. The council vehicle lights swept across them both. And in that moment, in the rain and the wreckage and the clarifying aftermath of everything, Reese felt something she had not felt in 15 years. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The place inside her where grief had lived for so long shifted one final time, and in the space it left behind, she found something she recognized. Purpose. For the first time in years, she knew exactly what she had to do. The most beautiful things are often built from the pieces of what broke us. If this story has touched something in you, hold on to that feeling. The healing is just ahead. The city looked the same. That was always the strangest thing about the aftermath of extraordinary events. The way the ordinary world simply continued. Taxicabs, coffee carts, a woman walking a small dog past a flower stall on Lexington Avenue, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in a midtown office, Council investigators were working through 412 names on a USB drive, and the largest trafficking network in supernatural history was, as of last night, finished. Reese stood at the window of Klaus Tower in borrowed clothes, an oversized sweater, soft trousers, and watched the morning arrive. She had not slept. She didn't think Klaus had either. He was at the far end of the room, standing at the window that faced north, hands at his sides, still as architecture, still as something that has been standing in the same place long enough to become part of the landscape. She crossed the room. She did not say anything. She simply came to stand beside him, close enough that their arms touched and stayed. Outside, the first pale light of December moved across the skyline. "I keep thinking about the courtyard," Klaus said finally, the voice of someone speaking from a long distance inside themselves. "Where Vladimir taught me to fight, there was snow. I was terrible at it." "I know," Reese said. "He told you that himself." The corner of Klaus's mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. He did. Silence settled between them, the good kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. "I am sorry," Klaus said, "for the years I spent making myself someone who could not be hurt. It seemed practical at the time." Reese looked at him. "How did that work out?" He exhaled, long, slow, 5 centuries in it. "Poorly." She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, simply the way you take someone's hand when you are standing beside them in the cold and warmth seems like a reasonable thing to offer. His fingers, after a moment, closed around hers. 3 days later, Klaus presented the USB drive to the full Vampire Council in a closed session that lasted 11 hours. Reese sat in an antechamber with Rocco. He had brought a container of leftover pasta from a restaurant in Little Italy, offered it to her without comment. She accepted without asking questions. They ate in companionable silence. "He'll be all right," Rocco said after a while. "I know," Reese said. "I've known him for 100 years. Rocco wound pasta around his fork with focused concentration. "Never seen him like this." "Like what?" Rocco looked up. His expression was layered, meaning stacked upon meaning like geological sediment. "Careful," he said, "with someone." When the session ended, 11 council members were removed from their positions. 2 officials in the human world were quietly handed to federal authorities with evidence packages that would take years to fully prosecute. The network's infrastructure, properties, shell companies, transport operations, was systematically dismantled. Arthur was spared a final reckoning. He was assigned instead to the victim recovery effort, a lifetime of legal work on behalf of the people his greed had helped cage. It was not forgiveness exactly, it was something more practical, and in its own way, more lasting. The council's ruling was delivered to the Vampire King in 4 sentences. The last one read, "You violated blood law, but the community owes you a debt it cannot easily repay." Klaus read it once, folded it, put it in his pocket. Then he came out to the antechamber, looked at Reese and Rocco sitting on the floor eating cold pasta, and sat down between them without a word. Rocco handed him a fork. 3 months later, on a night in early March when the last of the winter ice was letting go of the city, They were married at the Metropolitan Opera House. The ceremony was held on the stage itself, beneath the great chandelier, before an audience of immortals and rescued victims, and one extremely emotional large man named Rocco, who cried from the moment the orchestra began and did not stop until well after the reception. Reese wore white silk with a streak of deep crimson at the hem, the color of both poppies and the graves where poppies are left. Around her wrist, her father's bracelet. In her hair, a single pin that had once belonged to a vampire queen she was only beginning to know she descended from. She walked onto that stage the way she had walked into every difficult room in her life, chin level, shoulders back, the body believing before the voice follows. But this time she was not disappearing. This time she was arriving. Klaus stood at the altar in a dark suit with no tie, his white hair loose, his eyes warm now, genuinely warm, in a way that still surprised people who had known him for centuries, fixed on her with the steadiness of someone who has finally found the thing worth being still for. Their vows were simple, written together at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, with cold coffee and crossed-out drafts, arguing gently about language, settling finally on the truth. To remain, to choose, again and again, for as long as choosing is possible. When the officiant finished, Reese leaned close and said, quietly enough for only Klaus to hear, "From waitress to queen, you still owe me a glass of wine that won't spill." Klaus laughed. A real laugh, full, unguarded, entirely genuine. And the vampires in the first 3 rows looked at each other in undisguised astonishment, because not one of them had heard that sound in 300 years. The orchestra played the finale of the magic flute. Rocco wept openly into a handkerchief the size of a small flag. Lena, seated in the 3rd row, leaned over to the vampire beside her and whispered. She was an actual waitress in Queens 6 months ago. The vampire looked at Reese on the stage and said without any irony, "She carries herself like a queen." Lena considered this. "Yeah," she said finally. "She always did." The Supernatural Opera Academy opened in Queens on the 1st of April, which Reese thought was fitting, given that the whole enterprise had begun with a spilled glass of wine and a wager that no sensible person would have accepted. It occupied a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the diner where she had worked double shifts for 3 years. The sign above the door was simple. Inside, a piano, folding chairs, a sound system. And every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, a group of children who had grown up in the margins of 2 worlds and belonged officially to neither. Reese taught them the way Luciano had taught her. Not technique first, not scales and breath support, and the architecture of the voice. This first. She would tap her chest, just above the heart, exactly where her father had once tapped hers. The voice lives here. When you are afraid, when you are tired, when the world makes you feel small, you breathe, you find it, and you let it speak. The Vampire King came sometimes. He sat in the back row on a folding chair and watched with the expression of a man who has learned, late in a very long life, that witnessing joy is itself a form of joy. Occasionally a child would recognize him and stare with enormous eyes. Klaus would nod gravely, as though this were entirely normal. It usually made them laugh. and once they laughed, they sang better. He mentioned this to Reese one evening as they walked home. She looked at him with the expression she wore when something moved her, and she was trying not to show it. "My father knew that," she said. "He said laughter opens the same place in the chest that music does." "He sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Klaus said. "He would have liked you," Reese said. "Eventually." "How long?" She considered. 40, 50 years. He was stubborn. So is his daughter. The street was quiet around them. The city hummed its familiar, indifferent song. Above the rooftops, a sliver of moon hung pale and bright in the cold March sky. Reese slipped her hand into his. The bracelet caught the light. The city felt different now, different from the life she had moved through like a ghost, invisible, waiting for a room that felt like hers. She had found it. She had built it. From a spilled glass of wine and one word, yes, said into the frightened silence of a room she was never supposed to be in. Yes. Some doors look like accidents. Some songs start with a spill and end at an altar. If this story has given you something, a breath, a feeling, a reason, to believe in what's still possible, carry it with you. It belongs to you now. They went to Italy in June. Not for a honeymoon exactly, though it was that too. They went because there was a grave in Milan that Reese had not visited since she was 12 years old. Standing alone with a single white flower from the corner bodega. No idea what to say. She knew what to say now. The cemetery was quiet in the way old Italian cemeteries are quiet. Not empty, settled, full of a long, accumulated peace. The air smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. Luciano's grave was simple. His name, 2 dates, a small carved treble clef at the base that 9-year-old Reese had asked for. Because whatever else her father had been, he had first and always been a singer. She knelt in the grass. Klaus stood a few steps behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the moment. She had come to love that about him, the way he knew, without being told, when to fill a space and when to leave it open. She set her father's bracelet on the stone. Not to leave it, just to let it rest there for a moment. To let the two of them touch again, the way they had not been able to since she was 9 years old. She did not cry. She had cried already, at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, in the back of a cab, in a hotel bathroom the night after the wedding. So unexpectedly it surprised her. Grief doesn't announce itself. You don't manage it. You make room for it. You let it move through you. And eventually, not all at once, it becomes something you carry differently. She sang. Not the Queen of the Night, not a weapon, just the Sunday morning aria, her father's, hers now. Quiet and unhurried, rising into the Milan night, the way warmth rises from stone after a long day. When it ended, Klaus knelt beside her. He placed his hand on the stone, briefly, gently. The gesture of a man making a promise that words cannot carry fully. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Reese picked up her father's bracelet, fastened it back on her wrist. Then she stood, took Klaus's hand, and they walked back through the quiet cemetery together. Past the old stones, past the jasmine, out into the warm Italian night. Back in Queens, the academy grew. Not dramatically, the way real things grow, slowly, by accumulation, by the daily act of showing up. Tuesday afternoons, Thursday afternoons, a waiting list by September, a second piano donated by a council member quietly making amends. Rocco appointed himself unofficial head of building maintenance and could be found most Saturday mornings repairing things that didn't strictly need repairing. Simply because he didn't know what else to do with the feeling of wanting to be useful. The children came from everywhere. Hybrid children. Human children from the neighborhood who wandered in because the door was always open and the music was the best thing on the block. Reese taught them all the same way. The voice lives here. She would tap her chest, above the heart, exactly where Luciano had once tapped hers. When you are afraid, when the world makes you feel small, you breathe, you find it, you let it speak. One Tuesday in October, a girl of about 10 came in for the first time. Small, her mother's eyes, her grandfather's stubbornness written plainly across her face. She refused to sit in the front row because she was certain she could not sing. Reese recognized her immediately. Not the child, the feeling. She sat beside her in the back row and said nothing for a long time. Then, my father taught me that the hardest part isn't the high note. It's believing you're allowed to reach for it. The girl thought about this. What if you reach and miss? She said. Then you've practiced reaching, Reese said, which is the only way you ever get there. The girl was not entirely convinced, but she stayed. The following Tuesday, she sat in the third row. Reese had her moment on a night in November, 1 year, almost exactly, from the Thursday when the storm came to Manhattan, when a waitress from Queens walked into a room she was never supposed to be in, spilled wine on the Vampire King's suit, and he smirked and said, "If you can sing this opera aria, I'll marry you." And she did. She was standing on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House, a benefit performance for the Victim Recovery Fund. The house was full. Somewhere in the fourth row, Klaus sat with his hands folded, his eyes no longer empty, not for a long time, fixed on her with the steadiness of someone who has found the thing worth being still for. She was wearing deep crimson, her father's bracelet on her wrist. She was not trembling. She stood the way Luciano had taught her, chin level, shoulders back. She looked out at the house, full of people and light, and she breathed. Once, the orchestra lifted, and she finally understood, not as something she told herself in difficult moments, but as a settled, bone-deep truth, that the room she had spent her whole life waiting to find had never been a place. It had been this: the moment you stop disappearing, the moment you let yourself be heard. She opened her mouth and she sang. This story reminds us that the things we carry the longest, the grief, the love, the voices of the people who shaped us, do not diminish us. They are the very material we are made of. Reese did not heal by setting her loss down and walking away from it. She carried it on to every stage. She sang it into every room. She passed it, transformed, into the hands of children who needed to know that their voice was allowed to exist. If you are sitting with a loss of your own tonight, a person, a chapter of your life that closed before you were ready, you don't need to do anything grand with it. Find the thing that belonged to them, the handwritten recipe card, the song they always hummed. Sit with it. Let yourself remember who they were to you, not the loss of them, the them of them. Then set it gently down. Make a cup of tea, and let the morning come. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. The story reminds us that the voice we carry inside, shaped by love and loss, and every Sunday morning we can still feel in our bones, was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be heard. Real courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to sing anyway, to stay when leaving would be easier, to trust that the people worth keeping will still be there when the music stops. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.